of Compliance Deconstructed. You're joined by Jessica Zeff, Elvan Baker, and Lorie Davis, your favorite compliance experts. Aren't we so much fun? So, thank you for joining us today. There's a lot going on in the healthcare compliance space. We've had the 2026 Medicare physician fee schedule proposed rule that was dropped. We've got a lot of discussion around AI and possible deregulation. We've had the Office of the National Coordinator drop two final rules around interoperability. There's a ton going on in this space, and that's probably just a small piece of it. But Elvan, Lorie, and I have come across a healthcare compliance case, a fraud case that is so absolutely interesting and absolutely amazing that we thought we needed to spend an episode fleshing it out, working, looking at it, and talking about it and sharing it with you guys. So, with that, I'm going to give the honors over to Elvan. She's just bouncing around in her seat. She can't wait to talk about this, and it's so cool. So, I'm going to hand over to Elvan to tell us a little bit more and give some background on the case. Elvan, you want to
All
go
right.
for it?
Yes, absolutely. Today we're going to discuss a real life case, and this is something that us three wanted to do for a while because it's really important to take the theoretical concepts of compliance and really apply them to how it plays out in real life for us. And one of the reasons why we like that is because we want to make compliance manageable and reachable for everyday folks out there, but also to bring attention to the fact that these rules and regulations and laws, they are for real. They have real life consequences. The parties who are a part of this ecosystem, they have to behave within these regulations and laws, otherwise there are consequences. So why I'm so interested in this case, I've seen this case, different articles go around it on one of our professional social media sites that everybody knows of, starts with an L. And I'm intimately aware of the case only because I work in therapy space. I currently still do. I deal with therapists in my current role at Rubato. I serve as their compliance leader when we deal with a modality that's used by therapists out there. Having said that, this case is about an outpatient physical therapy clinic, physical therapy and aquatic center clinic that is run by also two physical therapists, owners and operators, who are along with 20 of their best friends, I assume, who are joined in being indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of conspiracy to commit wire and healthcare fraud, among other things. What makes this case so alarming is the fact that actually the charges were filed back in 2021. The dates of suspected crimes happened from 2007 to 2021. However, as of today, quite a few of those defendants are still waiting for their sentencing, and they're facing prison time in federal prison. So, how does one get from being a well educated, licensed clinician where the system puts their trust in you to do the right thing, not just by patients' well being, but also to be the good stewardess of insurance money, to now face prison time in a federal prison, may I add, not the holding cell at your sheriff's department, is mind-boggling. But this case has pretty much anything and everything that us as clinicians are scared of. It has components of utilization of unlicensed technicians to provide clinical services, and then going back and billing for those services as if the actual licensed clinician performed them, to upcharging, upcoding, to changing
Billing
the
for
existing.
hours. Yeah, they're
Yes,
billing for
yes.
hours,
Oh,
having more hours in a day than you could possibly
It
work.
also has components of, going back to AI and all of this technology, where the clinicians gave their login information to unlicensed, their login information to their EMR system to unlicensed technicians or other employees. There is a billing specialist who knew it. And the biggest part for me, other than the clinicians part of it, is that this is one of those cases where the compliance officer also pled guilty, and she's
Yes.
also waiting for, it's a she, I believe. I apologize if I'm wrong. Ladies, correct me. But this person is also waiting for their sentencing. So it's big for us, but it's very applicable, and it does really paint a picture of what you should really not be doing as a clinic owner, as a clinician, as a employee who works for these clinics. Well, so where should I start? Where do we start?
Well, that's a really great I think that's a really great summary, but let's color it a little bit more because there's a lot more going on that we probably need to unpick. There was the boating accident and the whistleblower that came forward and all the controversy about that whistleblower, right? There was, the way that the FBI behaved, they were meticulous in their evidence and their data collection, and it was the evidence that they were able to access. So, medical records, claims, emails, texts, interviews of people. So, it might be worth unpicking some of those conversations as well and sharing them with our audience so that they understand the case is positively Shakespearean is what it is. There's a little bit of really everything. There's backstabbing, there's drama, there's all kinds of stuff going on in here. There is. It's one of those things. But as far as I can understand from the very beginning, the fraud from the beginning of the business. There were 2 therapists running the business, and they very intentionally committed fraud. There was evidence that it was very intentional. They instructed their staff to commit fraud, to bill when they shouldn't have been billing. They had the staff manipulate the schedule so that it would appear that patients and clients were getting treated at different times. So, for example, there were times that they should have been billing for group therapy codes. Well, they didn't do that. They manipulated the patient schedule to look as though they were seeing different patients at different times so that they could bill, and they billed the very maximum that they could, whether there was a legitimate claim in there to be had. So first of all, it was a very intentional process, right? And what we don't know really is why. Why did the compliance officer fail? What happened there? Why did the billing specialist fail? And no one whistle blew. The reason that the case actually came to light, if my understanding is correct, is because he's now a physical therapist, but at the time that he worked for the the business, by the time he worked for Hurdle and Brown, he wasn't a licensed physical therapist. He was, I guess, some sort of assistant or aide or a technician. I'm sorry, I forget exactly what the
Mhm.
title was. And he was told, they found evidence in a text that said, this is how you bill. It turns out, though, that he and his wife were on a boat owned by Hurdle and Brown. And this is important. I mention this for a good reason. But the boat exploded. Someone did something wrong. Allegedly, someone did something wrong. The boat exploded. Wife got killed. The physical therapist's assistant wife got killed. He got severe burns, and they settled out of court. But the reason this whole issue about the boating accident came up is because when the FBI got an affidavit, this individual came forward. When he found out about the case, he came forward to the FBI and he said, "Hey, this is what was going on within that practice. Here's what I was instructed to do, right? And he gave an affidavit, and then that affidavit was used by the FBI to get warrants. So the defense, the two guilty parties, it was Hurdle and Brown, their attorneys then argued, well, hold up, that can't be legitimate. This is revenge. He's being spiteful. That affidavit has no legitimate purpose. It was obtained illegally. Therefore, the warrant that was based on the affidavit is no longer valid. Well, the court said, "Oh, no. We really disagree with that." The court said, "Actually, this is a legitimate." But in the meantime, my point is, there was so much back and forth. There were so many court cases, there were so many hearings, there was so much to and fro about whether these warrants were actually valid, and that caused some of the delay in this case. But the court ultimately decided that they were absolutely valid. And why did they decide it was valid? Just so that, our listeners understand, I wrote the down. The court disagreed with the attorneys that the whistleblowing was revenge driven. And they said that based on all the other evidence that they had, the affidavit was valid based on the totality of the circumstances.
Mhm.
So why is that important? Like, why do I mention that? We get a lot of court cases that are thrown out or they're paused because there's been some sort of technical difficulty, let's call it.
Mhm.
Maybe a problem with the warrant or a problem with procedure, with legal procedure. And so a case can get thrown out or stopped or paused because of a problem with someone following legal procedure. In this case, the court says, hold up, we do think this affidavit and the warrant were valid. But in any event, there's so much evidence of wrongdoing. The totality of the circumstances justify it. We're fine. That's kind of mind blowing. Like, if you work in the legal space at all, the court was like, hold up, you are so absolutely guilty that we're not throwing this case out on any kind of technicality. We don't admit that there's a technicality, a technical violation of our procedures anyway. But regardless, there's so much evidence. Tough toodles. We're going to court. And that's what happened. So I think that's an important point to draw out for our listeners and for compliance professionals in this space. Hey, this, if you've got all that evidence, don't expect to get off on some sort of technicality. I mean, that's only one point in the case. There are many, many others. But thinking about how the FBI approached this and then how the court then considered its evidence and what happened, it took the whistleblowing complaint very seriously and gave a lot of weight to this whistleblowing complaint and then found all this evidence to say, hold up, wait a minute, there is a real case here. And the court said, well, regardless of the affidavit, we're going forward. Like, that's a pretty big issue.
Absolutely. I think the government proposed about, I believe, some 18 or 21 days of what they called it impossible days. And a lot of the compliance folks out there who do investigations will know exactly what that verbiage means, because those are the days when you look and you don't have to do a whole lot of digging. You look at, as a working adult, as an adult, you know, there are 24 hours in a day, there are working hours. And when you see billing that surpasses not just the normal working hours by an hour, by 2 hours, by 3 hours, but you see billing that is well past what could be explained by common logic, those become impossible days. Meaning the therapist worked at the facility for 8 hours and you see 9.5 hours of billing. just not possible. You can't be billing for services when you were not there physically. Therefore, that becomes an impossible billing day. So I think and government was really good at getting their information, proving who was there and who was not there, because again, people were on vacation. However, there was still billing and coding happening under that clinician, their license. And this is the part where this morning, when I was talking to my spouse, who also happens to be a therapist, and I said, if you're going to commit a fraud, why do you have to go above and beyond? I mean, you're already billing for services that were not rendered by a licensed clinician. Well, do it at 8-hour rate. Why do you have to
Wouldn't
go
you
on and do
keep
a
it a little
60?
bit a little bit on the down low?
I know, that's what I did. My husband's like, please do not say that. I'm like, yeah, but man, that's the level of brazenness here that also needs to be noticed, because I mean, if I have to always think about this, right? If you're a child and maybe you're a little girl and you want to sneak in your mom's expensive lotion and use that, I mean, don't, the jar is this big. By golly, do not take 1/4 of a cup out of there.
I know we're horrible people. Just so you guys know, if you're listening, we are not suggesting or telling you how to commit fraud. But to be very fair, the three of us were reading this case and thinking, oh my God, like how obvious could you be? And the bit that got me as I looked through the case is that Brown, Hurdle and Brown, they would actually put their instructions about how to commit fraud in text messages. And I found that mind blowing. So they left the full trail of what they did. So, piece of advice, if you want to commit a crime, not that I'm suggesting you ought to, but if you are going to commit a crime, don't leave such a wonderful trail for anyone to follow.
Call
Just a
us at
little.
1-800.
We'll, we'll try and help you dig yourselves
Lori's
out
going
of
to
it,
write out the
maybe.
standard operating procedure on how to do it. Well, what do you
But
think,
have
Lori?
either of you encountered, though, a therapist or even a provider? I know I have, who has claimed more hours than there are in a day.
Mhm,
I've come across that before in my work.
mhm,
Have either of
Absolutely.
you come across that?
Absolutely. I think it's really interesting here is that in some cases you had physical therapist assistants that are
mhm.
caught up in this, and they truly didn't appreciate what was they were being told to do. They did not realize that what they were doing was fraud. They were told to go into systems and do things and manipulate things, etc. And it was like, "Wait, what?" And only later did they realize, "Uh-oh, this is not good." And thankfully, when they went to court, that bore out. And so two of them were just
Mhm,
recently found not guilty
mhm,
because they truly didn't appreciate what they were doing. However, there was a third defendant that went on trial with them, and she had the appropriate education and knowledge that she did know what she was doing was fraudulent, erroneous, bad, don't do this. And she had degrees from her town. I mean, it's not like she went away somewhere. This was education she received locally. And it's mind-blowing to me that so many defendants can get caught up. And I think that's why it's so important about compliance education. And why, when we talked about this a few episodes ago, everyone was like, oh yeah, education, education, whatever. This is real life, why it matters. When we say don't do this thing, why it matters you don't do this thing.
mhm.
Weren't there
Absolutely.
Fortunately,
initially 21 defendants? And at
Mhm,
the time, I
yeah.
forget, and these might be old stats, but at the time the last I read, I think 14 had pleaded guilty.
mhm,
14 out of those 21 defendants.
Mhm.
I think you, Elvan and Laura, you have more up to date information. But what occurred to me after reading the case and everything that had gone through was how many lives were ruined. Like some legitimately, some of those defendants knew what they were doing, they knew it was wrong, and for whatever reason, they went ahead. but at least 14 of those knew and they pleaded guilty, which is mind boggling. You have this whole organization, multiple locations. What I don't understand is no one else whistle blew. If it wasn't for the guy, the physical therapist who had been involved with the boating accident, his wife had died in the
Hmm.
accident.
Yeah.
No one else came forward, and I really thought about this, and I thought, "Well, hold up. You have a compliance officer that was compromised. Like,
Hmm.
maybe they did. Like, maybe they went to the compliance officer. What they
So
didn't know was how to go to the OIG or how to
yeah.
report to CMS."
But that's another part of it. If you don't know how to, this is where the responsibility, we need to take accountability. People need to take accountability. Everybody is responsible for following the law. Then you have clinicians who have to follow their ethics and the law and the regulations that govern them at their license level, at, let's say PTA. And then there are the leaders who are also clinicians who have to follow step 1, 2, and then they have to follow it at a different level and make sure that the compliance was administered so that in case 1 and 2 fails, they can suspect and move on.
Yeah.
So again, that's why we talked in one of our past episodes about fraud, is that you could have known, you should have known, reasonably you should have known. And if you didn't know and you find yourself in a culture of wrongdoing, going along with the culture doesn't make it right. There's no right way of doing the wrong thing.
So I read several articles on this situation, and there were several people who did raise their hand and say, "Hey, something's not right here."
Hmm.
But when they raised their concerns, they were largely ignored. And I think, Jessica, back to your
Yeah.
point, that's why it's so important to know what are the next steps. Hey, I've told Jessica that this funky thing is going on. And
Hmm.
Jessica said, "Yeah, yeah, it's fine. I've made note of it. You're good." But if Jessica never takes it forward and all of a sudden the big scary man in the black suits show up, if Jessica hasn't fully documented that or made a good faith attempt, Jessica is, as she said, compromised as a compliance officer. Jessica is not compromised as a compliance officer. In full transparency, she was just an illustrative example. But I mean, there were people who did raise their hand and say, "Hey, something is not right." And some of the assistants raised their hand and said, "This is not right." But essentially, it fell on deaf ears. And I think that for me is the bigger concern. They went to the person that's supposed to be the go-to person. They went to the compliance officer. They went to their owners.
Hmm.
They went up the food chain and they were ignored. I think, and
Hmm.
that for me is what's so infuriating about this case. People were trying to do the right thing. Not everybody had bad intent.
Mhm. And I think another part of this is that they were using the EMR system that they were using is one of the biggest EMR systems that we have in the physical therapy world, WebPT. I'm going to put the name out there, Jessica. But this is where good auditing systems and the use of AI could have come handy, because if this system had an internal way of flagging things, maybe not to Hurdle and Brown, because if you're suspecting that the user of the system is crooked, really reporting it to them may or may not do anything. You're just going to lose the customer. But they could have done also something where they could have become the whistleblower and say, hey, we have this customer, and the way that they're using our product is flagging. So I'm not creating culpability, but again, and you know this from the bigger EMR systems, that there needs to be a checks and balances there too. If there's a 24-hour period, we just did that in my company at Rubato Life. We were looking at billable units, and somebody asked the question. I said, why don't we calculate more than X? And I said, because you cannot do that in a 24-hour period. I don't care if you have 100 therapists ramping it up. It's just not physically possible. So there's no need to calculate something that cannot happen,
Yeah.
and creating an internal system of as if it could happen. It couldn't happen. So
But
I
yeah,
do, I
Oh,
those
it
have to really
can
think about that.
happen. Oh,
it can.
I It
Go ahead.
can. Go ahead, Laura. Okay.
No, no, no,
So
go ahead.
I just want to make this point. I had been talking, I don't think organizations realize they have to be auditing their own records. They think the
Mhm.
EMR does everything except that. I and you have some great EMR companies, right?
Mhm.
And they do
Mhm.
have the checks and balances. That's wonderful, but that doesn't relieve anyone from doing their own auditing. And I did speak to an EMR developer, very small, offering services to home care agencies. And we were
Okay.
talking. And I said, okay, well, how do what are your checks and balances? I said it in other words. And he said, yeah, I don't have them. That's not my problem. And I said, excuse me? So you can bill and there's no way, there's no flag, there's no nothing to stop an incorrect billing? And he said, no, it's just not my problem. And he clearly hadn't built it in. He hadn't built it into his business model and he didn't care. He literally said to me, that's not my problem. The client has to monitor their own billing and coding practices and their own documentation. I don't care. And I said, well, have you made that obvious to your clients? He was like, well, why should I? I
And
didn't
I think there
work with
comes a
that
conflict a
business.
little bit, right? Because that's a business. They don't want to lose a customer. I can understand that piece, but definitely I think again, I'm not creating culpability and adding another layer of who could have, but we always want to go back in these cases and look at, okay, what were the stop gaps that did not happen? What else could there have been? And I think this is one of those where I don't know, I'm just looking at the idea of, oh, they're giving their logins to different people and they're logging from all over Glory. I mean, I worked for therapy companies where the my login only worked if it came from the IP address of the laptop that I was sanctioned to
So
have.
there were security issues as well.
So that's where I'm also looking, because now that EMR company have put themselves in a difficult position, because by what they didn't do, the and I don't know, but there could have been HIPAA violation, because those technicians who are not licensed, they're not under the regulation of HIPAA. They become nothing but a data broker, in all honesty, in that moment.
Yeah,
Well, no, they should have fallen under HIPAA, but they should have had
yeah,
some training, and maybe they
Mhm.
did, but it was all completely ignored. You could have great training, but
Correct.
cultural practice, you have
Correct.
a compliance officer and 2 owner therapists who are blatantly they don't care.
yeah, and keep in mind, though, these folks were also operating out of different locations.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
you've got 21 people spread over 2 or 3 different locations. I think there's some things in terms of IT security and privacy that are essential that were kind of missed and ignored. I think when I think about this, I think those nice EMR systems, one of the positives of using those systems is they've got a built-in audit trail. So they could easily see that PT assistant A or PT person logged in, even if it was the assistant logging in. So when they pull that audit trail, it's there. Or if the system was changed, coding was changed, that change will be recorded in the EMR. So while people might have thought, "Oh, we're skirting the system," those EMR systems, they're tracking all of that. I mean,
Well,
unless they did some.
for reputable ones.
Yes. I mean, but they were using, as Elvan said, one of the largest in the country, so unless they went in
Good
and did
point,
some
yeah,
manual manipulation,
Mhm.
which
uh,
they
which
did.
which they did, but that trail should still be in the cloud, so to speak, without, any of the HIPAA information. It was probably de-identified data sort of thing, but you could still see the manipulation. So I think that's the other thing to think about. And this is a landmark case. And then there's a sister case that happened in Oahu, Hawaii, that was equally as bad. And the owners got sentenced to even more prison time than the folks at Hurdle and Brown. So I think Hurdle and Brown, keep me honest, I think it was 6 years each. The
That's
Mhm.
what they're looking
gentleman
at, right? Yeah.
yeah, the gentleman in Oahu got 9 years. So they are taking this serious. So, I this is just mind blowing.
So a couple of other points I would like to talk about the jail time and the fines and everything else. But before we get there, another point that just occurred to me as we were talking, the structure of the business
Mm.
was it was an Inc. It was a corporation. Corporations tend to have boards. Now, I'm not an expert on board structure, but it got me thinking just as we were talking. It didn't even
Mhm.
occur to me while I was reading the case. Where was the board in all of this? Who was on the board? Were they not asking any questions? Did they have any compliance training? Did a board does have a fiduciary responsibility and they are there to guide the business. And I just wondered what the structure of that board was, how much expertise they had, whether they had any information about what was going on. Did they have any tools, any knowledge around healthcare compliance to understand the questions that they might have wanted to be asking? So the two, Hurdle and Brown, were apparently paying themselves $800,000 to $1 million a year. And they were on vacation quite a lot of the time. While they were instructing people to commit fraud, they were away. And I just wonder where the board was in all of this. I'd also say, I have to be honest, I couldn't help but wonder, this was fraud for Medicare, Medicaid, and actually commercial payers, which was another big point that, we talk a lot about fraud amongst Medicare and Medicaid for those services, but actually, there were a lot of private insurers or commercial insurers that were defrauded in this case as well. So you can be a commercial insurer and also lose a lot of money to fraud. But here's my question, and I don't mean to be, I don't know, rude's not the right word, but I don't have another word coming to mind at the moment. Did no one pick up on this? Like, what happened? No one got audited? If they were open, what, from 2007, was it?
Mhm.
Yeah,
2007 to
And the
2021 is
fraud
the
happened over 14 years?
Mhm.
yeah.
How did they fall through the cracks?
Good question. I do not know. Lori, do you know if they had a board of directors and what the like what
I'm not aware that there was a board. I think the owner served as the board, the way
Mhm.
I've read it in multiple articles. In fact, I was looking at it's an independent consulting firm, and one of the questions they ask is where was the the compliance officer, where was the oversight, where was the internal audit mechanisms
Mhm.
to
Yeah,
evaluate all this. They were asking all those questions, Jessica. I like this is for me as a compliance person, where was the internal audit? Where was the validation that coding and configuration changes were done appropriately? Where was the sampling? But if they, how were they not subject, especially in government business, not subject to any auditing? None.
I know.
No
I
provider,
even
no provider audits. Like typically when you do credentialing, you have to, that's part of it. You get audited. They look at you to make sure that you're on the up and up. You get a percentage score. Like, where was that?
I
I
know.
don't know how
My
they flew under the radar. And if
I
they worked
know.
in Medicaid, there were at least, 4 or 5 MCOs that they were reporting billing information to, maybe 3, let's say 3 or 4, depending on the time span. But I mean,
No
I'm just
payment
blown away.
integrity, no
No,
follow-ups with
no
patients to say, "Did you have
SIU,
an
no
appointment?" Yes.
Mafuku, no secret shop, no nothing. Like, this is surreal to me.
Yeah, it's the most bizarre thing. I don't understand it. Having lived and worked in these spaces, I don't understand how they fell through the cracks. And I think that was part of what maybe drove them to say, okay, well, I guess there are no consequences. So we'll just keep rolling. We've got a good thing. Why stop? But it ruined so many lives. Like that was the other thing that struck me, that there were a lot of people who were kind of led or who maybe didn't have too many choices. I mean, a job is a job. You don't know why people
Yeah,
do things the way that they do, right?
yeah,
But even still, there were so many people who knew better and then who ruined other people's lives.
So most of these
So
defendants, if they were a clinician, they're going to lose their license. They're not going to be able to get a license in Pennsylvania. Likely, they're never going to be able to get a license elsewhere because most states
Yeah.
anymore, the systems talk to each other. They have a checks and balances, and that's just and right. Yes,
And
Maria.
there is a provision in the one big beautiful bill that requires that interoperability that states check. So,
Mhm,
have you been convicted of a felony or something like
mhm,
that in any state?
Exclusion list,
mhm.
Exclusion
OIG
list.
So
exclusion
that's
list.
Welcome
that's
to the
done for
exclusion
those
list.
people, and like you said, how many people's lives are ruined because, and I'm not feeling necessarily bad, but that person was a breadwinner. This was their one trade. A lot of clinicians go to school, and this is it. This is their plan A through Z to feed their family with this, and now that's going to drastically change. But also, as you said, Jess, how many lives have been ruined? Imagine now your loved one is going to this therapy clinic and they have hip precautions, i.e., things that they are not supposed to be doing post op. And you think that the person who's telling you what to do is a trained clinician, only to find out that you were treated by someone who has no business telling you what they told you.
Yeah.
And years later, you're just still are not able to explain that pinched nerve pain you have. Go back and fix that. Genuinely, go back and fix that and explain that person who has a chronic pain now, because what they thought they were receiving were not what they received. So that's another life that's ruined that we don't realize.
No, I hadn't even occurred. That thought hadn't even occurred to me,
And
but
they
you're
have to go
totally right.
and going to find another therapist. I mean, the market in which this all took place isn't huge for practitioners. So I think this could be a challenge for them to switch services and go find how many patients gave up and didn't try and switch
Or how many
to another
patients
provider.
were told by their insurance where they have to get prior auth? You met your yearly limit this year for PT. Now you sit with that. Oh, well, but my case is in a federal. By the time you get around to this, again, that person did not get the services that they actually paid the premiums for. How unfair is that? This is very aggravating from a patient perspective. Ethically, it's very, very aggravating. And yet again, what does this create? This fraud is the fraud. This is going to create waste. Why? Because now those patients will have to be, well, it's not creating waste. I'm my mistake, but it's going to create a dominoes effect where those patients have to be retreated if possible with possibly more expensive procedures because the base were not followed and completed.
Well, but you use waste, and that also brings up another point. Okay, what about all the court cases and all the enforcement that has gone into this? Is all taxpayer money. And of course, the defense, you have 21 defendants. It's going on for years, this
Mhm,
court case,
mhm.
right? It's given rise to other court cases. And I couldn't help but as I read, and I read the arguments, and I read arguments about the evidence. And, at first, I guess Bertle and Brown, they invoked their Fifth Amendment right not to talk. So yada yada yada. The amount of money that has gone into enforcing this case. I'm not saying it shouldn't be enforced, like, not at all. But from a taxpayer perspective, these people have committed fraud. They completely benefited from that fraud, at least initially. They completely benefit. They live the life of Riley. And we're sitting there at the end of the day. I guess it's like any other case, I suppose. But just to point out, there are other costs associated with this kind of illegal activity. All of us end up paying for that in one way or another. We're paying for the evidence to be collected. We're paying for the court cases. We're paying for these people to be then put in jail
Mhm.
and follow up on the fines. And actually, so I was looking at the case from as it was written up at the Department of Justice. And actually, the law allows for a maximum of 30 years prison time and a fine of $500,000 for the business and $500,000, if I've understood it right, from each defendant or twice the pecuniary loss, whichever is the greater. So this kind of leads us into a conversation about the repercussions. So there are some important points here actually. So what's really interesting about the case is that the corporation was found guilty. The business was found guilty, number 1. But so were the two individuals. But Hurdle and Brown, in addition to the company being prosecuted, they get prosecuted as individuals. So we like to think that we're working for a company. And, we talked about the billing specialist gets prosecuted, the compliance officer gets prosecuted. So we like to think that we're under the protection of the business, that we're not individually liable. Well, this case really underscores that that's a false premise. You have the company that's prosecuted, so they're going to be fined, they're going to have to pay. And then you have individuals who are facing jail time and fines. So it's an important case. Your compliance officer you're not protected by the business. You become personally liable. And actually, the other thing that the courts say is, so why is it that, the DOJ, the Department of Justice says actually they could get the maximum penalty is 30 years plus this fine. So how do Hurdle and Brown get a proposed sentence of 6 years each? You think, "Oh, that's okay." But that's okay, they get 6 years, great, and they get fined. Well, what happened? How come they didn't get the maximum? I mean, this was all intentional. Why shouldn't they get the maximum? Actually, they cooperated. What the courts say is you cooperated, you pled guilty. They
I was gonna say, isn't
specifically
that a
say
yeah.
you both pled guilty. They gave up, I think one or two of them gave up their condos or they gave up different properties.
Oh,
I know, it's heartbreaking.
it's
Oh my
so
goodness. But
tough.
seriously, the court then said, "All right, well you've pled guilty, you've cooperated. So we're going to be a little bit more flexible." So we've heard about this. I think I've heard about this. We talk about, the courts or the regulators giving credit, in the
Mhm.
compliance space. We talk about what happens if you as an organization something goes wrong and you go to the regulator and you say mea culpa, we got it wrong. Here's what happened. We did a full investigation. Here's how we're going to remediate. And we talk about the strength of that, right? And how that looks to a regulator. Right or wrong, that's how it looks. Well, you get credit for that. I mean, it looks good, right? You had controls, your controls flagged or your audit flagged, and you're doing something about it. So you get credit, whether that credit is less of a fine or fewer repercussions, whatever it is. Okay, fine. Well, that's documented in this case where the court says actually they don't use the word credit, but they do say, well, you get a reduced sentence because of this, and that. And I found that to be really interesting. The court just spelled it out and said, okay, well, this is the kind of credit you get. And it's quite significant if you think 6 years versus 30 in jail, each of them.
Mhm.
That's,
It's a white collar
that's a
crime,
lot of
but
credit.
again, even white collar crime doesn't it's not a victimless, it's not a faceless crime for the reasons that I just said about the person who's living with the health consequences of their financial decisions. So look, I think a part of it is that what does government like is to make an example out of cases. This is why these cases also exist, not just to recuperate. They're never going to recuperate that money. 500,000 is nothing compared to 22 million that was billed and spent. Blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. Most of those defendants are going to say they can't pay. They're just going to file their taxes showing proof that they won't be able to ever pay. So it's not like you can recuperate. It's not like you're catching a scammer who is on a yacht somewhere in Bahamas and you sell the yacht and you distribute the money. It's not one of them. So I think one of the goals of the government is to make an example out of it. And It's not coincidental that this is one of the biggest white collar crime in Erie, Pennsylvania, my understanding from what I read, and that this is all over a social media platform that is meant for professionals because that's where those types of white collar professionals hang out. So the government is getting what they want to get out of it to an extent. Nobody's going to remember. I could care less about their condo or their orange jumpsuits. Like I could care less. Once they go, they go. You know. So I don't know.
No, but I do think it's a warning shot to
Mm-hmm.
think twice and
Mm-hmm.
looking at how thorough. I mean, and there's a lot to learn from this case. Why don't we go through let's just summarize for our listeners
Mm-hmm.
what the issues were, and then maybe have a short discussion about, well, what are some, let's have a recap because we've talked about this a little bit as we've been speaking. Maybe have a little bit of a recap, like how can organizations try and prevent this kind of outcome or this behavior? I mean, it's hard when your compliance officer hasn't really done their job, right? I mean, we all have had experiences or seen in our careers where leadership kind of veers off the wrong track, right? Or starts to, and you have somebody like a compliance officer who says, hold up, whoa, right? And they do their job. So let's just summarize because we are getting to time, and then maybe walk through some potential measures that organizations can take to prevent this kind of activity or try and minimize the risk, right?
If you guys want,
So,
I can count the ones and you guys can propose the ways.
well, that's fair enough. So, some of the things that were wrong, let's go through them. So, there's a total failure of compliance leadership
Mhm, mhm,
in the case,
Yes.
right? There was intentional overbilling, like there was no mistake about this. This was very intentional. Okay. Illegal use of unlicensed employees.
mhm,
Again,
Yes.
very intentional.
Yes.
mhm,
Evidence of 21 impossible days at the last count. Affected Medicare, Medicaid, and also private insurers. So we're just pulling out some unique aspects of this case. There was use of whistleblower information. It was highly contested, but at the end of the day, the court says totality of circumstances leads us to uphold the veracity of the affidavit and therefore the warrants. Personal and corporate liability, right? Corporate liability does not protect anybody. They're now personally accountable and responsible. Credit for cooperation was a theme that we picked up. There's jail time. There is actual jail time. That's not something, I mean, we mention it, we talk about it. We talk about the potential of jail time for fraud and for compliance violations that are, actually breaking the law entirely. But you don't always see it. It's not always obvious. And the amount of jail time is pretty incredible. There are costs to the system and to the defendants and the wrecked lives, whether they're the former employees or they're the patients involved. There's a lot of damage, more than enough to go around. And the fact that this was all blatant. Again, we come to being intentional about the fraud that was committed. So those are really the key threads of the case, I think. Did I miss anything, ladies? No. Okay. So we talked a little bit about how does an organization prevent this? How do you pick up on it? Clearly, I don't know that any particular I'm not sure how this would have come up within the organization when the leadership was doing all this intentionally, but
I
other
think
organizations.
having a compliance plan that includes external audits and
Yes.
internal audits,
Mhm,
regular, recurring, and validation reviews of
mhm,
coding and billing changes.
100%.
And medical
Because
records, having a
yes,
Mhm,
look, do these medical records make sense?
mhm.
Yeah,
So I'd
and the
say
notes, the documentation and notes during a treatment, patient scene, make sure it's all well documented. I think that could have helped.
making sure that people understand that even if you can't report within your organization,
There are places.
there
Yeah.
are other organizations you can report to. There are fraud hotlines, and you can report anonymously. So even if your organization doesn't have a whistleblower policy, if you're afraid that your employer will retaliate if you raise a concern, if there's no one else that you can speak with and you know that there's fraud or there's a patient safety risk, call the number, look up Medicare, look up your state Medicaid agency, look up the Office of the Inspector General. They all have anonymous hotlines and you can report. For those organizations that have a board, you need to be asking questions about the compliance program. I would have said you should be saying, hey, do we have anyone coming in?
Hmm.
Do we have an external review? Do we understand the risks involved in our
Hmm.
organization? What else? Oh, and the therapists. They have their licensing bodies as well. They have their professional bodies. They can also go to those and, ask for advice. What do we do? Anything else?
Look at your software system. Like you said, you want to make sure that the EMR system or the software system, any software system that you're going to utilize that has anything to do with your billing, coding, patient care, you want their ethics to match your ethics. You want them to have just as much desire to do the right thing as you, your therapist, your business. I think that's very important. I was just thinking, we when you said, hey, what could have been done differently, I was just thinking, man, it can't be that hard for a license number. Well, of course, this is for a company that wants to prevent fraud, not, you know
Perpetrate it.
but I mean, these are not hard systems for any software engineer to say, hey, this person is going to be on PTO. That license number is null and void from this date to that date, meaning nothing can be billed under it. Done. So you're not leaving it to anybody who you don't even have the option of doing it. So, just I was just thinking about, okay, what other ways that the system could have picked up on, that we could use technology that's existing in our hands to help prevent this.
I think it might have. I don't know. It's for the EHR. I
Mhm.
don't know that it's for the EHR company to say, and they don't operate that way. They're
No,
not sitting there looking for fraud.
no.
Some of them, if you say, hey, we need the back end records, yeah, they'll provide it for you, but
Mhm.
it's not their job to be
No.
watching and making sure you don't commit fraud. But the truth is, a lot of them do provide the functionality for reporting.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But are organizations looking at those? Are they incorporating them into their audit processes or are they ignoring them? And what we don't know is that functionality may have very well been there in this case, but the owners either ignored it or never looked at it. And I mean, it was intentional. What are you going to do? They either ignored it or never ran the report and never looked and didn't care.
Mhm.
I do
Yeah.
think it's curious that no IT professionals were implicated at all during this case, so I think there might have been an absence of IT professionals.
Some
So,
data and security person, or security and privacy person, I agree with you.
yeah,
I think they just utilized one compliance officer, and I'm sure, I don't want to say I'm sure, but you're right. I would use the same verbiage that you used, Lori. I think it's very curious that they only used one person, and one person only for almost the entirety of the employment. That person is not compliance certified. I just checked.
Oh, so that's another issue.
You look
Okay.
at their
So
background, and I'm not sure how she possibly got the position. So it's just as very interesting. I think curious and interesting is the word, is just that. Um,
Well, you wouldn't expect, like I said, you wouldn't necessarily expect an IT person to be monitoring for that kind of fraud. They're
No.
security generally
But
and
they would
making
know
sure.
that whatever login, because what's going to happen, this is inevitable human behavior, right? You give your login to another person, they forget because it's not in their muscle
That's
memory. So you're going to get a lot more calls about forgotten resets. And again, I'm just guesstimating things in my mind. When I'm entering a brand new password, I tend to make a mistake because my hands don't have that muscle memory yet. So likely those things happen because one technician is probably billing under this PT and that PT and that PT. And another thing I wanted to mention here from a therapist and employee's perspective is that we live in an age of information. You don't have to take the answer of this is how our company does it. When the rules that govern that business go beyond the walls of that business. I This is one of those cases where the company that you work for doesn't get to say, oh, this is how we bill group treatment. It has nothing to do how you want to do business. There is a higher board here.
yeah,
So I think we want to be we want to be good employees, right? We want to take what our employer says in good faith and listen and abide and perform, and amen to all of that. And I understand that the place that they were employed, maybe that was the only option for employment for that person, and I can
yeah.
understand the psychology behind it. However, this is one of those, it's not like saying we answer the customer. Our process for customer service callbacks is 48 hours, not 72 hours. It's not one of those choices, you know.
No, but we recognize, right? We've done this long enough and we're people at the end of the day as well, right? We weren't born yesterday. It can be really hard to raise a concern, especially when, there you don't know of another outlet. You're really dependent on that job. Like, we get it. We really get it. So the best we can do, I think, is encourage folks in that position to get advice, to get some help. If you feel you can, then make an anonymous reporting to an agency outside of your organization if that's what you feel you need to do. Or get some advice from your professional body. There are lots of compliance resources out there. Get some support. Maybe, also, I don't know. Eh, all I can say is, give a little bit of empathy to some of those
Yeah,
staff.
absolutely,
And
especially those who don't
I
hold the license. I mean, you look up to your leadership. You look at them
that's right.
successful, taking vacations, and that's why it's important. The gravity of what they've done is worse than the person who just simply listened to. Why? Because you are in a position of power and influence.
Yes. I'm more angry at the compliance officer. I really see the role as one that is based in ethics and that you're towing a certain kind of you have to give a certain image, right? You're setting the example, and I get really frustrated with compliance officers and compliance professionals when they don't uphold the values that I feel come with the role. It gives all of us, I think, a bad reputation or a bad name, or compromises the work that we do and the respect for the position. And that, I think, really frustrates me, as well as the ownership. I'm still thinking to myself, I can't believe, two people came up with this actually complex fraud. Yeah,
And
this
executed
complex
it.
scheme. And yeah, and executed it.
Mhm,
I'm really shocked. It took some gumption to do.
mhm,
But at the end of the day, I think, as we wrap up, the other thing I'd say, the other suggestion I would make to listeners is that there are so many resources around healthcare fraud.
mhm.
If you don't know who to talk to or you don't know what it looks like because your organization doesn't support you in that way, have a look. If you're not sure what fraud is and you want to know a little bit more, or you have a feeling you're not comfortable with something that you're being asked to do, as Elvan said, there's a lot of information out there. Have a look. Go to the Medicare website.
Mhm.
They and the Office of the Inspector General, they do some free training, and I know a lot of health plans or payers, if you look on their website, especially for providers, they'll have free education, like free webinars on their website. In fact, with a lot of my clients, my smaller clients who can't afford a big fancy bells and whistles training program, I direct them to their payers or their managed care organization. And I'll say, see, look, there's this free training on fraud, waste, and abuse, and it's really good. So if you want to get a bit of a bit more confidence around what fraud is, who you might be able to report to, what suggestions you might be able to make to your boss or your leadership or your compliance officer, how you might have that conversation. There are some resources out there. And of course, like I said, professional bodies and whistleblowing if you need to go that route. Right. Is there anything else, ladies, that we want to say on this topic? It's a mind-blowing case and really worth having a look at. We encourage our listeners to go have a look at the case and really understand for yourselves what was going on. And I mean, it's an interesting case in and of itself. And it reads very interesting. It's kind of an easy read despite the complexity, because there is so much going on and so much to pick up on and to understand. But it is fascinating. It's a great class. It's a great case for training and case studies. And we encourage you to go have a look.
Cautionary tale. And like I said,
It
otherwise,
is.
give us a call 1-800 Compliance Deconstructed.
We do compliance, we do therapy, we do, we listen, we're all ears. As Judge Judy used to say, we put on our listening ears all the time. She used this phrase. She used to say, put on your listening ears. And for some reason, I love that phrase. Put on your listening ears.
I
All
have a
right,
2-year-old. I
enough.
keep asking where the listening ears are. And yesterday she looked at me and said, "We go." Like, where did yours go?
Oh, that's so sweet. Well, just so you know, you're going to be saying put on your listening ears for like the next 18 years.
Clearly,
Get used to the phrase. All right. Any last words, Lori? You've been kind of quiet this episode.
I was
She's never this quiet.
I was listening and taking in a lot of the dialogue. You and Elvin had a lot to say, a lot more I say on on this topic than I did.
I know, but I was mean. I rely on you to be the practical one and to,
I
keep
tried to
me in
be
line.
practical. I tried to be practical. I brought up folks being declared innocent. Not everybody was
Yes, you
guilty. The
did.
facts folks raised their hand and were ignored. I tried to advocate that
this is why people
this
need to
isn't
watch
the
the
only case.
episode where Lori was shaking her head continuously, actually, and giving us the body language.
Um, the Oahu, Hawaii is the second case of this type that they've gone after that's big dollar. This is multi-million dollar. I think that for me. So I think this episode was a lot of me reflecting, but this is why compliance matters. This is what happens when compliance goes wrong. Again, I was reading articles where they kept saying, where was the compliance officer? Where was compliance? I don't know that when people are intent on doing bad, what you can do as the compliance officer when you know, in this case there was no real board to go to. It was only an ownership of two gentlemen, and these two gentlemen were intent on doing wrong from all accounts. Their guilty pleas kind of reinforce that, and I don't know what you can do. This is hard. And in full transparency, this one hits home. You know, I'm originally from the Erie area. And so I am familiar, you know, with this business. I have driven past one of their now confiscated businesses. It's in a nice area close to the Lake Erie beaches. It's so this is hard. This one's hard. I also have a lot of empathy for the patients that were
Mhm.
impacted
Yes.
and the folks that raised their hand and said something was wrong and were ignored. I think there is nothing worse than when someone raises their hand and says, "Hey, there's a problem," and you are ignored and you keep raising your hand and you don't know what to do.
Mhm.
Should they have
Agreed.
Googled? Should they have Googled and gone to OIG heat trading? Probably, but they didn't know any better. They didn't know what to do and they didn't have the tools. And this is a travesty for me. This one's a
And
travesty.
even if they had the tools, you are asking people who might very well need that job and have very
Mhm.
few options.
Yeah.
Correct.
You're putting them in a position that they shouldn't have ever been put in.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
God forbid truly something happened to one of those patients. Who's gonna live with themselves? I mean, we're talking about like simple things like, oh, the chronic pain. It's like, what if they actually dropped a patient who broke like there are so many scenarios where this could have gone into other than the boating accident, which is already bad as is, like that could have had other
Yeah.
like
I
we could have found us in
yeah.
different
I
ways.
think I think for me it was more that they were doing aquatic therapy, not
Ugh.
just physical
Mhm,
therapy.
mhm,
So things could have really gone south. This organization did physical therapy, but they did aquatic therapy too. And I think when you put those two components together, there has a ton of potential for
mhm.
challenge and
100%.
just disaster. And so, yeah.
Okay? Good thoughts. And I didn't mean to minimize the time that we spent. We didn't really get to talk very much about the Oahu case, but it's a really, really good point. This isn't the Hurdle and Brown case isn't just a one-off for anyone who might want to think, yeah, this is just, the government, I don't know, saber rattling. Actually, no, I don't think it is. There are a lot of smaller cases. If you're in the space and you keep up with the enforcement, you see a lot of fraud cases. It just happens that the extent of this fraud and everything that was involved. But the Oahu case is another one of those that's similar in many respects and a great case study of actually this this Hurdle and Brown case is not a one-off. And actually something that we didn't talk about, and then we'll end. I know I keep saying that, but we know that the current administration is very hot to trot on fraud, as maybe they should be. But also that definition of what fraud is has been expanded. So for those organizations that really need to maybe strengthen their processes around monitoring and detecting and reporting and addressing fraud, this has become as important as ever to get a grip on your processes.
Mhm,
Double check. There are going to be a lot more, and there are a lot more resources now being
mhm.
dedicated to picking up on fraud. There's going to be a lot more enforcement
Or
if what I'm understanding is correct. There's a lot more dedication and resources and an expansion of what is considered to be fraud. You got to be really careful. So, listeners really need to keep that in mind as well. If you thought that you could fly under the radar, the likelihood is getting less and less. Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible because anything's possible. I'm sure one day pigs will fly. Can't wait, but you never know. Maybe there'll be
Mhm,
pot bellied pigs. That's what I'm looking forward to. However, I digress. It's a good opportunity to review your compliance
mhm,
processes and really understand, are you training your staff?
mhm,
Do you have
Yeah.
good reporting mechanisms? Do you have ways of identifying your fraud? Have you done a risk assessment?
Yeah.
mhm,
Do
mhm,
And
you
is it
have an audit
documented?
plan?
Is it documented? Do you have a paper trail? Is everything up on the up and up so that when you get the knock on the door, you are ready to produce it? Not maybe at a moment's notice, but with reasonable notice because it takes time to compile things. But having it together, documented, if you did training, make sure you've got those attestations of who attended training. What was the scope of that training? Have it available for someone to look at to confirm that you covered things like Stark, anti kickback. all those things, billing, coding, log on, don't share your password. During compliance week, those pictures of a compliant desk and a non-compliant desk, maybe you include that in your training. That might have helped here.
And if you look around and you think, I think we're going to need some help, there's always Simply Compliance. There's always Lorie, me, and Elvan.
Mhm.
Hopefully, we're always happy to hear some feedback. Would love to hear about what
Absolutely.
you think of this episode and any comments. We welcome input. So do us a favor. If you enjoyed the episode, or even if you just learned something, but you think we're dull and boring and absolutely, you don't know how we do this job, which of course we're not. We're fascinating and we're wonderful. I know that. That's okay. But whatever you think, do us a favor, leave us some feedback. We'd love to get other opinions, other
Mhm.
perspectives, as well as some feedback about the show itself. So with
Absolutely.
that, ladies, are we ready to wrap up for today? I can get it out. Are we ready to Oh my God, I shouldn't be trusted. Are we ready to wrap up today?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
All righty. Well, thank you everyone for listening in. Thank you, Lorie and Elvan, and if I do say so myself, Jessica, for being such great and enthusiastic participants today. Thank you to our listeners. We hope you'll join us for our next episode, and we'll see you then.
All right.
All
Thank
right,
you.
guys, take
Good
care.
job.